Energy Media readers, we're here today with Professor Lucas Davis, who is a professor of economics at the Haas Institute with UC Berkeley. Well, so welcome, Lucas.
Thanks for having me.
Now, look, you wrote a blog post that we went up today that was fascinating. It was about the electrification of heating in the United States, which on the face of it has got to be at least the second most boring topic we could possibly discuss. But when you get into the nuts and bolts of it and you think about it within the context of the energy transition, which is basically we're electrifying the global economy, the fact that 38% of Americans already heat their homes with electricity is a big deal. What is it not?
Yeah, this was surprising to me, actually. So I got interested in this because Berkeley, California, where I live, recently became the first U.S. city to ban natural gas connections on new homes. And so I dug into this a little bit, and I wanted to learn more about electric heating in the United States. So I pulled actually almost 60 years of data going back to 1960. And in 1960, only 2% of American homes had, for their primary heating source, was electricity. That's increased decade by decade until now in 2017, it's 38%. And I didn't realize that electrification had already, to some degree, happened to such a large extent in the United States.
Well, I'm going to tell you a little story, a bit of an anecdote. So back in the 70s, back when you were a twinkle in your daddy's eye, my father worked for Manitoba Hydro. And so big hydro dam on the Nelson River, and way up north, like 1,100 kilometers north of Winnipeg, which will mean nothing to you, but trust me, it's way up there. And because there was a hydro dam 10 miles away from the town, everybody had electric heat. And it basically what it was looked like any old furnace, except that it had heating coils in it instead of, natural gas. Yeah. And it was inefficient as all get out. And had we had to pay for that ourselves, it would have been a huge electricity bill every month. So fortunately, the electricity was provided by Manitoba Hydro. So I take it that in the intervening 40-some years, that we become a little more efficient in that technology.
So electric heating isn't, I don't think it's maybe as bad as you had growing up, but the technology has not changed that much. Why are more people using electricity? It's because it's become cheaper. So most places are not like, so let me take you back. In 1960, there were two states that had a lot of electric heating, Washington and Oregon. Same story. That was driven by cheap hydro power.
Wow.
But again, in 1960, it was 2% nationwide. What's happened since 1960 is that in real terms, electricity prices in the United States have gone down 40%. So electricity in real terms is much cheaper today than it was in the past, and I think that's a big part of the story.
Is there a chance to make electricity for heat an even bigger part of the story by improving the efficiency of that heating technology?
That's a good question. I don't think so. The classic electric baseboard heat, there's not a lot to it. I don't know to what degree that can be improved. But if you're like we are here in California with an excess of solar, so in March and April in California now, we have more electricity than we know what to do with. Why? In the middle of the day, we're generating so much cheap solar electricity that wholesale electricity prices are going negative in California during the middle of the day. If we continue to be in a world where electricity is being generated by cheap renewables, in a sense, it doesn't even matter. Electric heating doesn't have to get more efficient. It can still be the societal best choice for everyone to adopt electric heating.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question about battery storage plus renewables, because I think that the decline in battery price costs over the last 2 years is a story that's underreported, but it's a huge story. So look, another anecdote. 2 years ago, I was interviewing EV an automaker, and they were paying $195 a kilowatt hour for their batteries. Then last year, it was $135 a kilowatt hour. This year, we hear that Volkswagen has broken the $100 a kilowatt hour threshold. And a paper came out from the Rocky Mountain Institute it was just last week,
Yes.
saying that the next generation of batteries could get down by the end of, like, say, a decade from now, could be $50 a kilowatt hour. So suddenly, now you've got an abundance of cheap renewables coupled with an abundance of cheap battery storage. What does that do to air conditioning and heating, using electricity?
Well, I think this isn't exactly where you're going with it, but the first most immediate implication of cheap batteries is electric vehicles. So the transportation sector that's where that storage is most valuable. On the grid, electricity storage is valuable, but it's not as valuable as in a vehicle. In particular, I don't think we're even at $50 per kilowatt hour. You're not going to be using storage for seasonal storage of electricity, which is to a large degree what the issue is here in California. More scope for evening out within the day variation and using it to follow load. And we're seeing that in California. We'll see that elsewhere. But again, but you need to be turning your battery over at least once a day in order for the economics to make sense.
Well, that leads us to EV integration into utility grids. So a couple of months ago, I interviewed a fascinating guy named Bertha Debray, and he is responsible for integrating, for the Netherlands strategy to integrate their EVs into their utility grid. And he says that the Netherlands and China are leading this. Oh, and California, by the way, I guess apparently
Norway too.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it seems to me then that if those EV batteries are being put to use, so you're not buying specialty, or you're not buying specific purpose, single purpose EV batteries, that then changes the equation and the economics.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, currently, for example, the Tesla warranty, it's not exactly clear whether they'll allow that. But you're right. You're right that in a sense, the more EVs you have on the road, you can potentially tap into this massive existing amount of storage. Or even if you're not charging and discharging, if you align the rates that EV owners are paying with the economics, you can encourage them to charge at the time that makes the most sense for the grid. For example, I mentioned in California, we have all this really cheap power in the middle of the day when solar is generating. That's when we want people charging their EVs. So a crucial policy moving forward is making sure that those rates reflect the economics.
So if I can store, let's say I've got a couple of EVs in my garage, and so I can charge those up, and those can be then available. Doesn't that then create kind of an interesting microgrid management issue? Because, I mean, as a homeowner, I could have a net zero home or pretty close to net zero, and I would have all of this electricity available pretty much whenever I wanted it, because I've got two great big EV batteries sitting in my garage. It's coming in and out. I'm making a little money when the utility pays me for storage. Why wouldn't the PG&E in California's case, well, I guess it's bankrupt, it couldn't subsidize anything, but why, in theory, why wouldn't it greatly subsidize purchases of EVs? Because it's essentially building its own storage capacity.
I see where you're going with this, and I think the broader context is I have to layer onto the top of this the wildfire risk and the outages. In my home, we lost power for 24 hours. So there's a lot of homeowners in the Bay Area thinking about potential home storage situations. I think I see it also though from PG&E's perspective, and that is most of the expenses for a giant utility like PG&E are fixed costs. So transmission lines, and more importantly, distribution lines, meters, all this stuff is fixed. And whether you install storage in your home or you have an EV at your home or not, PG&E still has to maintain the distribution lines all throughout the city. They still have to have a meter at your home. They still have to have transmission, because PG&E's got to be ready for that we can have a week straight where in which the sun doesn't shine and everyone's going to be drawing power. PG&E still got to meet that. There's large fixed costs that have to be borne by the system, and they don't go away when you buy an EV.
Now, I was just a lowly energy journalist, okay? I'm not a PhD in economics, and I'm not involved in these discussions at the policy level. But it strikes me that these are all problems that are fixable or solvable with policy, with engineering, with new technologies. Am I right in that? I mean, can we look down the 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road and see this much more complex, robust, kind of I don't even know what to call it, a energy system, both at the city and the state and the national level?
Absolutely. What I would love to see, so as one example of this, smart meters. So if you go back 10 years ago, there were 0%, nobody had smart meters 10 years ago. Now, half of all Americans have a smart meter sitting in that's monitoring their electricity usage. That, in principle, facilitates dynamic pricing. In principle, you could be charging households and businesses real-time prices, minute to minute. When the grid needs more power, when we need you injecting more power, you can reduce we could reduce electricity prices or go negative. When the grid is being taxed, say a power plant goes down, and all of a sudden the social value of power has gone up a lot, prices could go up to reflect that. We're not doing that. We're not doing that. Even though the smart meters would allow it, the vast, vast, vast majority of customers continue to pay these very static, unchanging electricity rates. And as an economist, that pains me because it means there's inefficiencies everywhere in the system. And until you pass on that price signal to customers, you're not going to see all that behavioral change, technology adoption that you're talking about.
Now that raises the question, then how do we change that? Because if I'm sitting here and, okay, I'll put it in a Canadian context for you. So we just had a federal election literally, a couple of weeks ago. And the Liberals who were government and now are forming a minority government had a climate plan, came back during the campaign with additional climate policies that will make it very robust. Presumably, Canada can actually hit its GHG targets by 2030 and 2050. But one of the things that's included is 1.5 million homes in Canada by 2030 will be retrofitted and either be much more efficient or will be net zero. And that strikes me, given the context of our conversation about renewables and battery storage and so on, it strikes me that retrofitting homes must be one of the best uses for public subsidies or public support for this that I could think of. Am I correct in that?
What I know about retrofitting homes is that it's very expensive.
Sure.
It's very expensive. So, and let me give a little more context on this. For 50 years in the state of California, our building codes discouraged new home builders to use electricity. And the idea was that electricity was an inefficient fuel. Well, now the whole state's going the other direction, and we're headed towards. I'm doing a microphone update here. Sorry. And now, let me minimize this. Now the state's going the other direction, and now we're encouraging electrification. And so there's this. So it's an interesting flip flop, and it shows you how when conditions change, policy can change. Let me get this down here.
Well, let me jump in while you're updating your microphone, because if that's the case, then the policy framework for a energy transition, I think you just illustrated that becomes really critical, and I think you could say the same thing in Canada given what we're going through. Is then rapid revision of policy a key part of speeding up the energy transition?
I think that if we had a system in which externalities were priced, And then everything that would take care of it. That would take care of it by itself. Let me explain. In the old period, when electricity was inefficient, prices would have reflected that. And even without a ban or any regulation or command and control, people would have chosen more natural gas. Now, as electricity has gotten much cleaner, it should become cheaper. We're in a Pigouvian world, in a world where that's taxed. And then people, without having to do any sort of over-the-top policy, the prices would guide people to adopt more and more electricity. It would also reflect the variation across the United States. California, we have really green power. And actually, our electricity prices are too high. They actually are too high because our electricity now is so clean, but the prices are still high that we don't have enough incentive for people to go electric. And we actually have less electric heat than a lot of states. Go to the Midwest. The Midwest has electricity prices that are too cheap because a lot of electricity generation in the Midwest comes from coal. So it has high societal costs. Those aren't getting reflected. Electricity is too cheap. So we have too much electricity use in the Midwest. We have too little electricity use in California. What's the common denominator? You got to get prices right everywhere. And that'll lead everyone to make the right choices from a societal perspective.
Oh my, the thought of somehow coordinating 48, patchwork quilt of 48
yes.
policy, that sounds a little daunting. I mean, in Canada, we've got 10 and a couple of territories, and that's daunting enough. So you're talking about 48. Is that one of the things that's holding back?
I don't think it's daunting. You take a carbon tax. You can write it down on one piece of paper. On one piece of paper, how does a carbon tax work? We're going to tax carbon, $50 a ton. That's a one piece of paper policy. And what does that mean? It would mean Midwest power is more expensive. California power is less expensive. It doesn't have to be, yes, it can be a lot of states. Yes, it can be a lot of context. But when you use market-based policies, they don't have to be complicated to design or to administer.
I'm chuckling here because I've covered the Alberta government's. They had a carbon tax for a few years, and a change of government. Now that's by the by. But now the federal government is imposing the national carbon tax on Alberta and other provinces, and it's a bottom line. I know you economists don't agree, but consumers in Canada don't like carbon pricing. And so governments are moving to a combination of sort of the toolbox.
You've just frozen up on me. Markham?
Still here? How's that? We better now?
Yep.
Okay.
I just lost you when you said that consumers don't like it.
Consumers don't like carbon pricing. And so Canada has moved to a toolbox with 3 tools in it. One would be carbon pricing, yep. The other one would be regulations and standards, and the third would be subsidies for new technologies like electric vehicles. That combination of policy, that toolbox, seems to be much more politically palatable than just going with what I know economists love, which is carbon pricing.
Interesting. So in the United States, at a federal level, nothing is getting passed. Our Congress is so, the partisanship has become so strong in Washington that nothing's getting passed. I'm actually not convinced that a first best policy, a market-based policy, is any harder to pass than regulations or subsidies. I think it's all impossible to pass. So as an economist, I'm going to keep talking about about the first best policy, a market-based policy, which really I know from studying, I know it's the most efficient. I know it's the best way to do it.
Fair enough, Lucas.
I vote for that.
Fair enough. I know a number of economists in Canada that I've interviewed who would heartily agree with you. So look, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for this. And I'm going to be coming back to you in the future. I read your blogs all the time, and we'll be chatting. Look forward to chatting with you again.
Thank you very much, Markham. Tax carbon, and very nice speaking with you today.